Good morning, this is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Tom Mackenzie in London. These are the stories that set your agenda. French President Emmanuel Macron starts the search for a new premier after Francois Bayrou is booted out less than 9 months into the job. A tech stock buying spree pushes Asian markets higher with US shares near all-time highs on Fed rate cut optimism. Gold hitting another record. Plus, mining mega deal Anglo is said to near a takeover of Canada's Teck resources, potentially the sector's biggest deal in more than a decade. Good morning, happy Tuesday. So, a decent showing for European stocks by the end of the close yesterday, with gains on the stock 600 around 0.5%. Today, there's a little bit of pressure coming through. Futures off by 0.2%. We watched France, of course, expected that the PM was going to be ousted, and that, of course, is what happened and transpired yesterday towards the end of the day. So we look ahead to Macron and whether or not he selects a new premier in the days ahead. FTSE 100 futures currently off by 0.1%. US futures pointing to modest gains of 0.1%, building on the upside then that came through yesterday, closing up 0.2%, and again close to those record highs for US stocks. Fed cuts and certainly the expectations around those cuts, part of that story. Nasdaq 100 futures looking to add 36 points. Let's flip the board and have a look cross asset. The US 2-year yield is currently near the lowest level since 2022. Again, that ties into the Fed story, with markets now pricing in more than 3 cuts by the end of this year. 349 right now, largely unchanged on the front end. Euro dollar at 117. The single currency getting a bit of a lift today on weaker dollar, up 0.1%. Gold, fresh record highs for the yellow metal. This all ties back to the Fed as well on those rate cut expectations. 3,655, up 0.5% in the session today. And Brent at $66 a barrel, just gaining 0.7%. So building the upside that came through for oil prices yesterday. Let's cross over to the Asian markets right now. Our Asian equities reporter, Winnie Hu, standing by with a check on the Asian markets. What's standing out to you today, Winnie?
Yeah, so overall, a pretty positive session in Asia that we're seeing. MSCI Asia up slightly less than 1%, but it's now just about 2% away from reaching its record high. And that's really been driven by the expectation for the Federal Reserve to cut rates in September. And hence, we're seeing that big rally in the technology shares. Take a look at the Asia Tech shares. So actually, the heavyweights benchmarks with South Korea and also the Taiwanese benchmark, both up about 1%. And that's really been driven by the boost in the risk sentiment with the expectation of easing and also some tailwinds from Brockman overnight. And when you take a look, I would like to just highlight what's going on in Hong Kong. We see shares really rising on the optimism around the AI front. And that's because of, the surprise on the upside when it comes to the earnings for the AI part of the story, with Alibaba, Tencent really driving gains. And also expectation for the PBOC to ease further, because we're now expecting the Federal Reserve to cut rates. So a bit more room around that front. And take a look at Japan, kind of right now flat-ish. Investors are still wondering what's going to happen with the new prime minister to come. But for now, the expectation is mostly on expecting for more fiscal spending and economic growth. And actually, when we kind of look at the flip side of things, although overall quite positive in Asia, bucking the trend is Indonesia's assets, with stocks and currencies both down as we saw the finance minister suddenly removed. She's actually quite highly respected among global investors as that guardian for the country's fiscal health. So right now, a lot of attention on what the next finance minister is going to do, and expecting a bit more volatility and uncertainty around that front.
OK, Bloomberg's Asia equities reporter Winnie Su, thank you very much indeed for that update from the Asian markets. Let's switch to France right now, where the President Emmanuel Macron will appoint a new prime minister within days after Francois Bayrou, of course, lost that confidence vote in the lower house of Parliament, as widely expected. Whoever is picked will have to navigate, of course, a way to pass a budget in a splintered National Assembly, a reality that Bayrou reminded legislators about yesterday.
Parce que, mesdames et messieurs les députés, Ladies and gentlemen of the Assembly, you have the power to overturn the government, but you do not have the power to erase reality. The expenses will continue to increase even more, and the enormity of the debt, which is already unbearable, will get heavier and heavier and more expensive.
Well, for more, let's bring in Bloomberg's Caroline Cornat, who is outside the National Assembly in Paris. Day two for Caroline, who's been following this for us, of course, in close detail. Caroline, who can the president then rely on? Who is Macron likely to reach out to for this premier role now?
Well, of course, the most important is that he acts really quickly. A lot of people within his entourage are saying he should really do it really soon. He said last night within the next few days. Will it be today? Will it be after tomorrow? Because tomorrow we have a national day of rallies planned with the far left calling to block the country. Now, it is possible that he will remain with a centrist figure, such as, for example, Sébastien Lecornu, the Armed Forces minister who's been cited. The problem with that is, of course, opposition parties are going to say this is going to be the same policies of Emmanuel Macron. So, of course, the socialists, they now say they want the job. Olivier Faure, the first secretary of the Socialist Party, was on television after the confidence vote last night saying we are ready. Macron should give us a chance to govern. Of course, the problem with that is that Macron's camp is going to lose the support of some of the moderate right Republicans. Bruno Retailleau, the current interior minister, was also on TV last night after the confidence vote saying he's not going to join any socialist government. Gabriel Attal, who is obviously leading the MPs group of Renaissance Party, Macron's party, here at the National Assembly, said in his speech yesterday at the National Assembly that they should try and work together, have some kind of non-aggression pact in order for the socialists and the centrist camp to not make the next prime minister collapse, especially when there is a need to pass a budget before the end of the year. But the problem is that in France, this coalition idea is not really in the spirit of French politics.
OK, so that's the complexity, isn't it, facing the French president? He looks at this next pick. Caroline, talk us through the market reaction. We were looking there on screen. French futures actually pointing higher in the session today. To what extent are the markets kind of looking through the immediate political risk?
The reaction was really muted yesterday when Bayrou fell, because obviously the collapse of his government was mostly telegraphed, mostly anticipated and already priced in by the markets. Now, what happens next, of course, depends on who is appointed prime minister and what kind of budget we're going to see. If it's a socialist budget, technically it's going to be watered down in terms of savings. Francois Bayrou was planning 44 billion euros of savings. The socialists have already proposed an alternative budget with only 22 billion euros of savings, so half of that. So this, of course, may impact the markets as well. We're also going to see a lot of ratings over the next few weeks. We have a Fitch ratings this Friday with a likely downgrade of France from Fitch, so investors will technically watch that. And even if there is a coalition, sort of pact of non-aggression government next, there is no reforms inside. There's nothing big that can happen to really overturn the structural problem of French public finances over the next 18 months before the next presidential elections in 2027. So perhaps markets will settle for this kind of status quo where nothing really happens over the next 18 months in France.
OK, Bloomberg's Caroline Cornat in Paris with the latest, of course, and we continue to watch what Macron does in terms of that potential appointment. Turning to the US now, and House Democrats there have released an alleged birthday note, what they describe as and claim is a birthday note from Donald Trump, the US president, of course, to Jeffrey Epstein, intensifying scrutiny of the president's past interactions with the late disgraced financier. The release stems from a trove of documents received by the House Oversight Committee, including a birthday book compiled for Epstein's 50th birthday. The White House says the note is fabricated. For more, let's bring in Bloomberg's news desk editor, Balazs Pence. Balazs, what do we know? What is the latest then in terms of this release from House Democrats?
So, yeah, as you said, this document comes from this pile of material subpoenaed by the House Oversight Committee from Epstein's estate and released by the Democrats, which immediately drew protestations from the Republicans and very strong pushback from the White House. The president has, of course, sued the Wall Street Journal when they first reported on the existence of this document, and they have claimed that it's fabricated. They pointed at that signature as not matching Donald Trump's signature. The president famously said that drawing messages like this is not something that he usually does. But clearly this gives the Democrats an opportunity to move the conversation to a topic that has been uncomfortable for the president, that the Republicans would rather not have a discussion about. So now the question becomes whether they can force the House into a vote over the release of all of the Epstein files, or the Republicans manage to move the conversation to something else.
OK. Bloomberg's Balazs Pence with the latest then update. Of course, the Jeffrey Epstein scandal back in focus, particularly when it comes to US politics and the president, of course. Now to the equity markets and back to the rally that we saw in tech stocks, helping to lift the S&P 500 near record highs amid expectations that the Fed, of course, will cut interest rates next week. That is fully priced in by the markets. Expectations, we're going to get a very dovish Fed in the weeks and months ahead. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Valerie Teitel for more. To what extent, then, Val, is this a market that is fully betting on a dovish pivot, and are there any warning signs, or at least warning calls, around the risks that could be posed but a Fed stepping into cuts?
Yeah, Tom, a lot has been said about the fact that we're going to have a more dovish leaning Fed going forward, maybe as soon as the vote next week, if Stephen Moran's vote in the Senate gets confirmed in time. But you have to mention as well, not only are we having that rally in the front end, yields lower and those policy sensitive 2-year yields, we're also seeing a substantial rally in the back end. That 30-year yield that came a whisker away from 5% just a week ago has now rallied 30 basis points, trading below 470 as we speak. A lot of questions as to what's driving this, but Tom, it could have a lot to do with positioning. Remember, these curve steepening trades were extremely popular. You could say this is the first hints that that trade is beginning to get stopped out, and that could have global ramifications. Now that we have these catalysts out of the way, the Japanese government has fallen apart and JGBs are still holding in okay. We had that French vote yesterday, seemed not to rock OATs, those French bond yields either. With all these catalysts out of the way, it seems to be paving the way for flatter curves, and that's what the market is very offsides. However, if you want to point to some risk on the horizon, look at the price of gold, trading at a fresh record high overnight. Yes, this has to do with lower front-end rates, perhaps the worry that the Fed could ease too much going forward, but you could also question whether this has to do with Federal Reserve independence and investors worried about that. And to that note, we could have Trump's next Fed governor pick in that seat by that September 17th Fed vote. Stephen Moran, his Senate banking confirmation, the vote could be tabled tomorrow, which paves the way for the broader Senate vote to happen just one day before the Federal Reserve convenes next week. And this could start to pose some major questions on Federal Reserve independence once we see how this new player on the governor board votes.
Yeah, and JP Morgan as well, putting out a note suggesting there could be some risks around sell the news on the back of that expected cut from the Fed on September the 17th. Valerie Teitel across the markets for us. Thank you. Here's what else to think about through today then. 11:30 a.m. UK time. The Chancellor, UK Chancellor Rachel Reeves, will face parliamentary questioning, so we'll keep across that for you, of course, given the pressure that the Chancellor is under leading up to that budget announcement expected in November. And tonight, on the tech front, Apple's event. It's the biggest product launch of the year, the iPhone 17. So all the details coming through from Apple that, of course, on the AI front is still lagging. And staying on tech, US earnings, we're going to get Oracle reporting, so a touch there on the AI story for that software giant as well. That ties into the Oracle story. As you can see, year-to-date, the stock is up more than 40%. You can get a roundup of the stories you need to know to get your day going in today's edition of Daybreak. Terminal subscribers can go to DAYB Go on the terminal. And the takeover and potential mega merger in mining is front and centre. Talking of that, coming up, Anglo-American said to be in talks to acquire Teck resources over in Canada, potentially one of the largest mining deals ever. We're going to get you the details of that Bloomberg scoop. That is next. Plus, later on in the show, we will be speaking with Matthew Brockman, managing partner at HD Capital, about how AI is revolutionizing software and his company's journey to $100 billion in assets under management. That conversation coming up later in the show. This is Bloomberg.
Tech is integrated into every aspect of our lives, from finance to defense, AI to entertainment, and from the road to the stars. Bloomberg brings you the latest stories from the people and companies pushing the tech sector to new frontiers and the politics that shape global tech markets. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. Watch Bloomberg Tech Europe. New episode Friday, only on Bloomberg Television.
Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. Now, US shares in Canadian miner Teck Resources soared after the bell. That's after Bloomberg reported that Anglo American is near a deal to acquire the firm in what would be the biggest mining deal in more than a decade. Let's get the details on that Bloomberg scoop. Bring in Martin Ritchie from our metals and mining team. Martin, the question around all of these is, what is the likelihood of this deal actually materializing?
Absolutely, Tom. This is, another year, another big potential mining deal. In 2023, we had Glencore trying to buy Teck, and last year we had BHP trying to buy Anglo, and now two of those companies, Anglo and Teck, in what looks like fairly early stage talks about an acquisition of Teck by Anglo. This obviously combines two big mining companies that have a lot of good copper assets together. That's the metal that all these companies want, and a lot of these deals are driven by. But there's no guarantee that this is going to happen, and there's several things that might stand in the way. There's the reaction from Teck, which is really controlled by a single Canadian family. There's the role of the Canadian government, which is putting more scrutiny over overseas acquisitions. And Teck's biggest shareholder is actually, apart from the Keevil family, is a Chinese firm. So there's all sorts of potential complications on the way to a deal, I would say.
And Martin, given your understanding of this, of the broader sector, what would this deal, if it comes to pass, and you've outlined some of the complexities, what would it mean, do you think, for the broader mining sector?
Well, as I referred to, there's been a lot of sort of putative deals that haven't actually happened for one reason or another. Boards, executives, and investors in the mining sector are very wary of doing major deals. So if one does get over the hurdle, if this one does go through, you will see other firms, try to perhaps look more closely at deals themselves. The fact that BHP's attempted takeover of Anglo last year didn't go ahead kind of put the brakes, I guess, on activity for a while. But this is obviously a sign that the executives are still putting the rule over potential deals across the sector.
OK, let's see if they get this one across the line. Bloomberg's Martin Ritchie, thank you very much indeed, with the update on what could be one of the biggest mining deals in about a decade. Martin, thank you. Coming up, Ethiopia's mega dam is finally online. We're going to switch focus to that story. It's riling its neighbours. The details are next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. Now, Ethiopia is set to inaugurate Africa's biggest hydroelectric dam. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam will power homes and industries across East Africa. But it is sparking tensions with both Egypt and Sudan over the flow of the crucial River Nile. For more, Bloomberg's chief Africa correspondent, Jennifer Dabasaja, joins us from Joburg. Jen, why is this dam so significant then?
Right, Tom. This really today is really the culmination of a years-long push by Ethiopia that has been full of delays, disputes, as you were mentioning there, Egypt and Sudan, and even reportedly deaths. But yes, it has been 14 years really in the making coming up to this inauguration today. But if you take a look at really the dispute here, Egypt and Sudan are concerned about their access to the Nile River. This has been something that they have at least tried to sit down and hammer out over the past few years, but it's not come to any sort of agreement, so much so that at one point they were even potentially looking at going to war. There was potentially a war in place. And just in a joint statement recently, we heard from the two sides saying that they agree that the dam is in violation of international law and entails serious consequences for the two downstream states and represents a continuous threat to stability in the Eastern Nile Basin. And if you hear from Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed of Ethiopia, he obviously disputes this, and it's actually seen as something of somewhat pride for Ethiopia. They did not seek any international funding to get this $4 billion dam made, and really was able to capitalize on the fact that they could, as you said in the intro there, power the homes in the second most populous African nation, potentially power several industries, and look to be a hydropower exporter. But the question is, will this contention with some of the other downstream players and the neighboring countries sort of outshadow what they're trying to do here? But today we are waiting to get the official inauguration of this biggest hydropower plant in Africa.
OK, Jen, you talk about some of the tensions and even the possibility and the risks of conflict. What is, just unpack what is underpinning the concerns from Ethiopia's neighbours?
Yeah. Well, so if we take a look back a few years, Tom, many people point to the fact that the Nile is very central to a number of these downstream players. And in particular, with Egypt, they actually rely on 80% of the Nile's rivers for their own irrigation and their own agriculture. And so their concern is that if we do start to see Ethiopia, in fact, trying to fill up the reservoirs at this hydropower plant, potentially then they're going to be affected in some ways. There's also been some concern from some of these neighboring countries potentially about any sort of seismic activity happening with the hydropower plant. Now, we've heard from Ethiopia, they have disputed the fact that this could potentially happen. But clearly, as I was pointing out there in that statement, there still seems to be some unity between some of the downstream players between the downstream players, Egypt and Sudan. But really, Tom, this sort of gets to the friction here with the Nile River. If you take a look back just in the history books, there have been treaties about who exactly owns or has access to the Nile. Years ago, Egypt had access to the Nile in an agreement that was given by the UK. But the concern with some of these downstream players is that Ethiopia went in and unilaterally decided to build this dam without any sort of insight. And if you take a look at some of the other players in the neighboring region, there has been some agreement with Uganda and some of these other states that are around the Nile. So it's really this point of contention, this river, and that's really all culminating in the inauguration, the official inauguration of this hydropower plant.
OK, Bloomberg's chief Africa correspondent, Jen Debasaja, on that story around Ethiopia and the dam and some of the tensions. Jen, thank you. Coming up, succession fight over. Rupert Murdoch's family has settled its trust dispute over control for Fox and News Corp. We bring you the details on that family drama coming, it seems, to a close. That is next. This is Bloomberg. Good morning, this is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. Happy Tuesday, I'm Tom McKenzie in London. These are the stories that set your agenda. French President Emmanuel Macron starts the search for a new premier after Francois Bayrou is booted out less than 9 months into the job. A tech stock buying spree pushes Asian markets higher, with US shares near all-time highs on Fed rate cut optimism. Gold hits another record. Plus, mining megadeal Anglo is said to near a takeover of Canada's Teck resources, potentially the sector's biggest deal in more than a decade. Let's get to the futures picture then. European futures pointing a little lower after gains of around 0.5% yesterday. Worth noting that the French futures, the CAC 40 futures, are currently pointing to gains of around 0.8%, despite, of course, what was expected, that outcome in terms of the French Prime Minister being forced out and Macron, the President, having to find a new premier. European futures down 0.4%, but French CAC 40 futures are pointing higher. FTSE 100 futures pointing to losses of 22 points. S&P futures, after some gains of 0.2% yesterday, also pointing slightly higher, close to those record highs. The US 2-year is at 350. A little bit of selling pressure coming through right now at the front end. Yields up 1 basis point. Euro dollar at 117, the single currency, a little stronger versus the dollar in the session. Gold at fresh record highs, rallying 0.5% just in the session alone. And Brent on oil prices, $66 a barrel, up 0.7%. So further price increases coming through for oil. That is currently the move that we're looking at. Let's get back to French politics then. And French Prime Minister, of course, Francois Bayrou, losing that confidence motion in Parliament. That news came through at around 6 p.m. UK time, 7 p.m. in France. French bond futures then hardly moving as investors await the appointment of a new Prime Minister. French OAT, so sovereign debt, have been under pressure, of course, amid the political turmoil. Bloomberg's currently gone up, is outside the French National Assembly with a guest. Caroline.
And I'm very happy to be joined by Anna Boata. She's the head of economic research at Allianz Trade, bright and early from the National Assembly in Paris. Anna, good morning.
Good morning.
We've seen the reaction on the markets was quite muted last night when Francois Bayrou lost this vote of confidence. Where do you see the spread between the French and the German 10-year yield going?
Yeah, it's true that it was widely expected, so no surprise from that perspective. And actually, we have seen the spread around 76, so I think it's hovering around that level and closer to 80 than closer to 75. In our baseline scenario, actually, we are still looking for the new government to be able to pass the budget by year end. Very stretched, but still happening, where it will bring the spread between 80 to 90 bips. Now, of course, if things are not getting into the right direction, and after several attempts and maybe even several governments by year end, we end up into a snap election scenario for which we give between 15 to 20% probability, then the spread will go beyond 100 basis points, right? So it's basically baseline somewhere around 80, maybe 90, depending on how stressful this process is. But then we could get to 100, 110, and even beyond.
Macron needs to name a new prime minister. He said he's going to do it over the next few days. Does he need to go this time for the socialist route? Is that necessary to kind of create some stability for France and for investors?
Well, that's the key question, and I think it's part of the central scenarios. Why? Because he needs to try everything, right? We have tried the centrist, the rather right centrist. Now we need to give the chance to another party to try to get a budget. Now, I think the key question between a socialist party, a new prime minister from the socialist party or a centrist, is the level of fiscal consolidation. So I think we cannot go to 40 or beyond 40 billion euro. It's rather around 20 billion. And this is where the markets will look very closely, because we know that more or less 20 billion will bring us to around 5% of GDP fiscal deficit, which is still above what the European Commission would like to see if we get to this 3% target in 2028, 2029. So clearly the attention will be on the type of austerity, the impact on growth, and then the level of fiscal deficit next year.
Is there also a risk that the social anger that we are likely going to see tomorrow and next week with these national days of rallies actually recreates the sort of yellow vest movement we saw in 2018, and that is obviously something that also has an impact on the economy?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, any kind of stress, political stress, social stress, uncertainty is cutting growth by a couple of thousands of points of growth. For example, since the beginning of the year, we see growth being cut by 0.2 0.2 points only because of the political uncertainty. On top of that, you have the trade war, which is cutting also 0.3, so you already lost half a point. Now, if we have social movements which will be of a size of the yellow vest, of course, we could add on top 0.2, 0.3, so cumulatively, you could even get to a cumulative impact of 1 point, right? So, of course, the more you have this impact, the higher the fiscal deficit. I mean, only 0.2 percentage points from the political uncertainty cost 4 billion euro more to the French fiscal deficit. So, of course, that is one of the key elements to try to avoid, because we know that strikes are having economic impacts.
Obviously, another scenario is that if there's more deadlock, perhaps another vote of confidence here in the National Assembly over the next few months, then President Macron has no choice but calling snap elections. In that scenario, what is the reaction on the bond market, and in terms of the impact on the economy, what do you think this can be?
Yeah, of course. I mean, as I was saying, the longer we stay into this scenario, the higher the probability of snap elections. Still, we don't see it as a baseline scenario, but let's imagine this happened, then the spread will go beyond probably 120 basis points in the worst case scenario. And this is where the ECB might play a key role, right? Between 100 and 120 basis points, probably the ECB will need to slow down the quantitative tightening, because we know that by doing that, it adds upside pressure on rates. And the French 10-year is already at 3.4%, and it will probably stay at the level. But if we slow down that 40 billion per month of euros to, let's say, 20, then we could bring the yield below 3%. Now, of course, if it goes beyond 150 basis points, then the ECB should act into a sort of quantitative easing, a sort of TPI type of measurement, right?
So we could possibly go from this political crisis currently to a potential further Eurozone debt crisis. That's not impossible at this stage, correct?
I think it's a temporary scenario. If the spread goes to 130, 150, then the ECB will activate the TPI. Why? Because the contagion risks will start to be visible. Italian spreads will also rise to relatively similar levels, and this is where you could have some liquidity strains. And this is where when the ECB will act. But then, when the ECB will act, of course, the spread will start to normalize, going back to 100 or 90 basis points. So it will be a temporary crisis, but then, of course, during this period of time, the deficit will be even higher, probably 5.5% of GDP, and the growth will be much lower, below 0.5% in 2026.
Clearly, we're not out of the woods yet. Thank you so much, Anna Boata, the head of economic research at Allianz Trades from the National Assembly in Paris. Tom?
Great conversation, Caroline. Great insights. Thank you. Caroline Conard in Paris for us. We're going to have more coverage, of course, on the French story throughout the morning, including an interview with the vice president of the country's largest business union association, the BUA. We'll also speak to an MP from Emmanuel Macron's Renaissance Party. Now to politics in Norway, where Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre has declared victory in a close election where his Labour Party played to voters' fears of uncertainty regarding taxation and welfare policies. Støre is headed for another 4 years in office after Labour emerged as the Nordic country's biggest party, while the opposition bloc saw a shift to the right. And in corporate news, Rupert Murdoch's family has settled its trust dispute, cementing Lachlan Murdoch's control over Fox and News Corp. The deal ends a years-long legal battle and gives Lachlan sole authority. For more, let's bring in Bloomberg's Ros Matteson. Ros, this has been quite the drama, hasn't it? Does this succession drama then for Rupert Murdoch, does it put this issue to bed once and for all?
Yeah, well, by and large, it does. As you say, this was going on for some years, real-life succession drama. But what we have now is a case where the other three kids, Prudence, Elizabeth and James, no longer, have those voting rights as part of the family trust. So they don't have that interest in the company. They're basically being given $1 billion each to walk away. And the concern had been, because they each had that voting right, that the three of them might band together to move against Lachlan at some point. And Rupert Murdoch obviously concerned they would take his empire in a different direction, perhaps move away from some of the conservative, elements of things like Fox News and so on, and there would be a collective push there. That's off the table. Lachlan is obviously now free to run the company possibly for decades to come. You can't imagine there's going to be cozy family dinners necessarily going on after all we've seen playing out in the courts. You don't know what the family dynamics are, but in terms of the business itself, this is now put to bed.
And to your point, this is a re-empowered Lachlan then with this sole control, effectively, of this empire, this business empire. What are we watching? What do we expect him to do with all that power that he now has?
Well, certainly, like many companies, News Corp, Fox are adapting to a fast-changing media landscape. But he has put in a new streaming service at Fox recently, sports, media, entertainment. Fox One, over at the Wall Street Journal, he's moving to boost digital subscribers in the real estate business in Australia, digital advertising. You can see very much adjusting to a digital landscape across all the parts of the company. But it is a big, sprawling company. There are lots of other smaller parts to it. So does he take a look at some of that and say, do we need to shrink any of that down to really focus here on driving, a much more modern media outfit in a digital landscape?
We can't really think about these media assets owned by Murdoch and the Murdoch empire without thinking about the political impacts as well. How is it likely? What are the potential political ramifications of this power?
Well, particularly in the US, obviously, where Fox is a juggernaut and has had a boost with Donald Trump being back in the White House and back in the limelight, and their ratings have gone up as a result. However, even that is a fragmenting landscape. You have Donald Trump inviting all kinds of influencers, podcasters into the White House, getting press passes, massive followers, and he's talking to them very directly. He's also had some falling out with individual Fox anchors, and so it's not all sunshine and roses there either. I mean, obviously, Fox is the biggest player in this space. This removes the prospect of Fox, moving away from its conservative roots, and that had been, again, Rupert Murdoch's concern. But even there, you're going to have a shifting landscape where how do you counter all these rising individuals who are being just as popular?
Ros Madsen, thank you very much indeed on that real-life drama, of course, around the Murdoch family and the Murdoch dynasty and succession, of course, playing out in real terms at the end of a significant chapter in terms of that saga. And we'll see what happens next. Now, some of the stories making the news this Tuesday morning. Banca Monte de Paschi has won over more than half of Mediobanca's voting rights, effectively giving it control over the Italian investment bank. According to a filing, Mediobanca investors have tendered more than 62% of the shares for Monte Paschi's unsolicited bid. The €15.9 billion deal is set to create Italy's third largest lender. The CEO of Barclays, meanwhile, has warned a windfall tax on banks in the UK could hinder the government's push to boost economic growth. CS Venkatakrishnan told a Barclays conference in New York that UK lenders already pay a higher rates than their peers in the US and Europe. Coming up after the break, we're going to speak with Matthew Brockman from private equity firm HG about how AI is revolutionising software. We're going to have that interview next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. Microsoft signing a multi-year deal worth up to $19.4 billion with Nebius Group for AI cloud computing services. The agreement runs through 2031 and is testament to how AI is changing the software space. Shares in Nebius soaring in after-hours trade. It's a reminder that the demand around data centers as companies, individuals and enterprises continue, of course, to integrate AI solutions is still there. So let's bring in at this point then HG, one of the leaders when it comes to SaaS software as a service in the PE space. That's according to the FT, is now the Britain's second biggest private equity group with $100 billion in assets under management. They've got about 55 companies in the portfolio, including Visma, IFS and Audit Board. Managing partner Matthew Brockman joining me now. Matthew, thank you for joining us in the studio. Bright and early, 25 years being marked this month for HG, and I mentioned that $100 billion AUM. On the AI piece, because this seems, if you look back over the 25 years, over the more than 2 decades for HG, this seems to be a pretty pivotal moment in your journey. As you look across the portfolio and more broadly across the space, what is your level of conviction and confidence that European companies can actually compete and win when it comes to AI transformation and integration for real economic benefit?
Well, I think there's a debate that's a defining technology, right? If you go back to like PCs in the 70s, then the internet, then SaaS, really this is kind of the next wave, and it's probably about as big as the PC, sort of evolution in the 70s. So this is a very, very meaningful transformation. I guess what we see as the big opportunity is diffusion. So at the moment, you're seeing sort of the foundations being built, right? The models, the infrastructure, the chips, the hardware, where there's an enormous amount of capital clearly gone into the ground. What then happens over the next years is how does that diffuse into the economy? So how do people use it? How does it work into what people do every day in their job? How does the intelligence start to work through into the advice that might be given to people? And I guess that's where there's a play for Europe, right? If you want to call it that. There's an infrastructure piece as well, which we can talk about how that gets provided by sort of, by government support and so on. But a lot of this is how does the everyday person filling a tax return in or paying their employees or lawyers, like how do they really use this product, when it's at sort of full strength?
So where across your portfolio, again, more than 55 companies, are you actually seeing AI have a transformative effect on the economics of those businesses?
There's two main areas, right? One is how well can I run a software company? So if I'm running a software company today and I'm not using AI for enhancing my developer productivity, enhancing my customer support, enhancing some of my sales and marketing processes, I'm way behind the curve. So every single one of our companies by now will be using AI, finding probably a couple of points of margin on automating workflow, automating the stuff of actually running a software company that builds products for customers. There's then a whole separate group, which is how do I build products for customers, which are AI first. And that's something we've been pushing on now for probably 18, 24 months, which is how do I use a sort of our own team, actually a catalyst team that we have as HG, to put developers into our companies to build AI-first product. And that allows our software companies to serve their customers with AI product. So, enhanced advice, enhanced data extraction, whatever it might be. And I would say we're at the front end of that. That's something we've been pushing for now 12, 18 months. But we see great opportunity from that in terms of how our software companies can serve their customers.
How binary is it? Because some of your portfolio companies could do very well in terms of leaning into AI. But if they don't do what you've outlined, they could also become very vulnerable.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a point in time is probably not like a month, but it's a few years where essentially if you either react to AI and adapt to it and think about how your product's going to adapt, or you will gradually start to wane, right? Because the average lawyer, the average tax person, the average white-collar employee is going to be AI-enabled. They are going to be used to the idea of I do my job every day with AI enablement, and if we can't provide software and technology that leverages AI, we're going to be under threat.
Which particular pieces of the SaaS and software market are looking most appealing to you right now?
I think anything which is basically a sort of white-collar professional service. So if you think about, let me give an example. So legal profession, it's probably $1 trillion of spend on lawyers in the world, right? But about 20 billion of spend on software. So you call it 2% of overall spend on the legal industry goes into technology. You're now seeing essentially a huge sort of intellectual capability within the technology, like this thought within the technology, which makes that so much more addressable from the software. And so now these things don't happen overnight. You have to build products, they have to get shipped to customers. The kind of last mile effect of like adoption is a big factor, which is kind of where we spend a huge amount of our time. But that's where there's so much economics, because you're essentially thinking about how do I augment labour? How do I need, frankly, less lawyers to give the advice? How do I need less developers to build software? Those kind of white-collar applications will really, we've been talking about it for probably 2 years, but that's where I think it's really going to play through.
I want to briefly get your views on the capital markets. Visma, one of your portfolio companies, choosing to list in London. I know you're constrained on what you can say on that. Klarna is going to be listing in New York. Are the capital markets starting to thaw? Are we going to get those exits again?
I think so, yes, and I think so for the right companies. So I won't profess to be a capital markets expert, because I'm sure you've got more qualified people on this show, but essentially we see, for businesses that have, growth, resilience, and are leveraging some of these macro trends, of AI or technology, yes, I think there's an appetite. We've certainly seen it in the US. You saw Figma list a month or two back. You're seeing very significant interest in these kind of companies. It feels like that is open.
Because DPI and returning liquidity to investors for the PE industry more broadly has been a challenge.
Yes, I mean, huge focus for us, certainly distributed to paid in. So cash capital withdrawn and then paid back. So essentially, the industry invested a lot of money between sort of 2019, 2020, 2021, right? In the interest rate environment was very low at that point. And you sort of got this indigestion effect, which is how is that money getting back to our investors after 4 or 5 year investment periods? I'll be honest, we've been relatively fortunate. So we have a bunch of software companies that have got good growth. So we've been able to essentially get liquidity in pretty much every company that we've ultimately tried to get liquidity in. But there is, at an industry level, there is definitely an indigestion problem. and it's widely understood of like how do I get that cash back to investors who do need cash.
Okay, really smart context in terms of what's happening in this space. Matthew Brockman, thank you very much indeed for joining us in the studio, managing partner at HG. And don't forget, staying on tech, the next episode of Bloomberg Tech Europe this Friday, 6:30 a.m. London time. We're going to be looking at how AI is changing the way we fight disease, including an exclusive interview with Demis Hassabis, the CEO of Isomorphic Labs, and of course Google DeepMind as well. So tune in for that conversation. It'll be on YouTube as well across the weekend, but broadcasting first, 6:30 a.m. London time on Friday. There's plenty more coming up. This is Bloomberg.
Doesn't feel to me like the policy rate is extraordinarily restrictive at the moment when you look at risk appetite. And so, risk appetite is definitely, out on what I'd say is the more exuberant end of the spectrum.
Goldman Sachs CEO David Solomon there talking about the fact that he doesn't see the need right now for rate cuts. Here's what's happened with the S&P 500 year to date, up 10%, and of course since April up around 30%. JP Morgan, meanwhile, coming out with a warning that maybe the Fed cut that we're all expected now on September the 17th might be, in fact, a sell the news story, given their concerns about tariff pass-through and what could be a tick up in wages on lower interest rates. That is the warning from JP Morgan. They are still bullish on US equities, but they're adding that caution to the story. Let's flip the board and have a look at what's happening in terms of Apple, because this is a key stock to watch, of course, over the next 24 hours or so. It's the biggest product launch later today, of course, out of the Cupertino-based company. The iPhone 17 is going to be in focus, one of the ultra-thin and slim iPhone 17s as well. Is that something that's going to propel the fortunes of Apple that is still, of course, lagging on that AI story? They've seen a lot of headcount moving to the likes of OpenAI and Meta. Can they heal the wounds around AI? Can they play some catch-up? The hardware will be in focus today for Apple. And this is the suppliers rally that's come through on the back of this story. Bloomberg Terminal users, by the way, can get access to these charts and others used throughout the show at GTV Go on the Bloomberg Terminal. There's plenty more, of course, coming up, including an interview with Oliver Doré, the CEO of German defense company Hensoldt. But the opening trade is up next. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.